It was a quiet evening on June 14, 2022, when Nathaniel, Nate, Carter walked through the door of his home, expecting a familiar, comforting embrace from his wife, Emily Johnson. The sounds of her humming in the kitchen and the faint smell of her favorite cooking would have been the perfect end to a long day of military duty. But tonight, the house was eerily silent. Nate dropped his keys on the hallway table, a chill crawling up his spine. The house, usually warm and welcoming, felt empty. His boots echoed on the hardwood floors as he walked toward the kitchen, half expecting Emily to be busy preparing dinner. But when he reached the threshold, the kitchen was dark, untouched, and the air stale. Something was wrong. A cold sweat prickled at the back of his neck as his mind raced. "Emily," he called, his voice shaky. Silence. Nate's heart began to pound in his chest as he stepped further into the house. He reached the living room, his eyes scanning the room in confusion. The TV was off, the couch cushions were disturbed, nothing like Emily's usual meticulousness. Then, his gaze fell upon something that made his blood run cold. There, lying in the middle of the room, sprawled across the carpet, was Emily. Her body was lifeless, an unsettling stillness hanging in the air. A pool of blood spread from her abdomen, staining the floor, and her face was frozen in a look of shock. Her hand lay outstretched, as if she had reached for something, or someone, before her life was stolen from her. Nate's legs buckled beneath him, and he staggered back, unable to comprehend what he was seeing. His mind screamed at him that it wasn't real, that this couldn't be happening. But the blood on the floor, the coldness of her skin, the vacant look in her eyes, he couldn't deny it. His world shattered in an instant. His body trembled with the weight of horror and disbelief. He choked on his breath, his mouth dry as he struggled to form coherent thoughts. His first instinct was to run to her, to somehow make it better, but the terror in his gut paralyzed him. Instead, his hand fumbled for his phone in his pocket, clumsily pulling it out and dialing 911. 911, what's your emergency? The operator's voice broke through the fog in his mind, sharp and demanding. My wife, Nate stammered, his voice breaking as tears threatened to spill. He swallowed hard, trying to steady himself. She's dead. There's blood. I think someone killed her. The words sounded foreign in his ears, as if they weren't his own. He couldn't believe it, but the words were escaping his mouth, and they were real. His wife, the woman he had loved for years, was gone. The operator's voice was calm but urgent, guiding him to stay on the line as help was dispatched. But in those agonizing moments, as Nate stood frozen in his living room, he felt as if the world had come crashing down around him, and nothing would ever be the same again. The call had been made, but little did he know, it was only the beginning of a nightmare that would unravel everything he thought he knew about Emily, and their life together. Emily Johnson had always been someone who appeared to have it all. Raised in a small Texas town, she had stood out among her peers as a beacon of success, intelligence, and determination. Her ambition had driven her to earn a scholarship to the University of Texas at Austin, where she studied marketing and graduated with honors in 2014. Even back then, her future had seemed bright, a series of stepping stones leading to a career many could only dream of. After college, Emily moved to New York City, where she quickly landed a job at one of the most prestigious marketing firms in the world. She quickly rose through the ranks, earning accolades for her sharp business acumen and her ability to turn failing campaigns into success stories. To outsiders, she seemed untouchable, the perfect picture of modern success. But beneath this carefully crafted image, Emily's life was far from perfect. The pressure to maintain her flawless exterior weighed heavily on her, a constant reminder that she was living a life dictated by societal expectations. Though her career was flourishing, Emily found herself feeling empty, as though something vital was missing, a gnawing sense of unfulfillment that she couldn't shake. It wasn't long before she met Nathaniel, Nate Carter, a Marine officer on active duty, and the two quickly became inseparable. Nate, with his quiet strength, his dedication to his country, and his unwavering loyalty, was everything Emily thought she needed. They married in a beautiful ceremony in 2018, and to the outside world, they were the golden couple. They volunteered together, supported veterans' charities, and enjoyed their idyllic life as a picture-perfect family. However, the more Emily settled into this perfect marriage, the more she began to question if it was truly what she wanted. The image of the loving wife and successful professional, which she had spent so many years cultivating, began to feel like a mask, one that she could no longer wear comfortably. As much as she loved Nate, there was something deep inside her that longed for something else, something she couldn't define. It started with the faintest stirrings of curiosity, then gradually became a powerful urge she couldn't ignore. Emily found herself attracted to women. This realization shook her to her core, leaving her grappling with guilt and confusion. She had grown up in a conservative community, where same-sex relationships were frowned upon, and had always adhered to the idea that marriage was between a man and a woman. But as time went on, her attraction to women intensified, and she found herself trapped in a silent battle between her love for Nate and her undeniable attraction to others. For years, Emily buried these feelings, convinced they were wrong, that she simply needed to conform to the life she had built. She was proud of her marriage, proud of her accomplishments, but a part of her felt suffocated by the very life she had worked so hard to create. She convinced herself that the love she had for Nate was enough, but in the quiet moments when she was alone with her thoughts, she began to realize that it wasn't. This inner turmoil began to manifest in subtle ways. Emily became more withdrawn, restless, and uncertain. She tried to focus on her work, on the charity events she organized, on the perfect image she had built. But all the while, a part of her was screaming for release. And that's when she met Sophia Green. Sophia, the wife of Pastor Daniel Mitchell, entered Emily's life like a quiet storm. They met at a church event in the spring of 2022, where Sophia's warmth, intelligence, and beauty immediately caught Emily's attention. Sophia exuded a calm confidence that seemed to draw people to her, but for Emily, it was something more. There was a magnetic pull that she couldn't resist, a spark of attraction that she had long tried to ignore. When their eyes met for the first time, Emily felt something shift within her, something she hadn't felt in years. Their friendship grew quickly, with Emily finding every excuse to see Sophia again. They would meet for coffee, exchange quiet conversations after church, and eventually, they began to take long walks in the park. Each moment with Sophia felt like an awakening for Emily. She had never allowed herself to feel something so strong for another woman, but with Sophia, it felt natural, undeniable. The guilt that she had suppressed for so long began to melt away, replaced by an intense longing she couldn't control. But the more Emily allowed herself to fall for Sophia, the more she felt the weight of her own guilt. She was still married to Nate, still playing the role of the perfect wife, the model of respectability. And yet, with Sophia, she felt like she was finally living her truth. For the first time in years, she felt alive, as though she were finally being true to herself. But there was a deep fear that accompanied this new love, a fear that Emily had never fully confronted before. She was terrified of what would happen if anyone found out. The consequences of such a revelation were too dire to imagine. Nate, their families, their friends, the community, everything Emily had worked so hard to build could come crashing down in an instant. Yet, despite this fear, she couldn't deny what was growing between her and Sophia. The conflict inside Emily intensified. She was trapped between two worlds, the life she had built with Nate, a life that was comfortable but increasingly hollow, and the forbidden love she had found with Sophia, a love that threatened to destroy everything. Her heart was torn, and every choice she made seemed to push her deeper into a world she no longer recognized, a world where nothing was as it seemed. But Emily couldn't stop herself. The more time she spent with Sophia, the more she was drawn into a web of desire, guilt, and secrecy. And in the deepest corners of her mind, she knew there was no going back. As Emily grew closer to Sophia Green, the wife of Pastor Daniel Mitchell, the attraction between them deepened, evolving into something neither of them had anticipated. What had started as a casual friendship quickly blossomed into a secret, forbidden love, one that neither woman was prepared for, but both couldn't resist. Their first meeting had been innocent enough. Emily had admired Sophia from afar at a church event, captivated by her calm demeanor, the way her words carried such authority, and the warmth that radiated from her smile. Emily couldn't quite place it at the time, but something about Sophia struck a chord deep within her. And when their eyes met for the first time, the connection was instantaneous, undeniable. Sophia's beauty was magnetic, but it was her intelligence and kindness that drew Emily in. For the first time in years, Emily found herself truly intrigued by another woman. After the event, they exchanged pleasantries. Nothing overtly flirtatious, but the way their conversations lingered after the others had left, the way their smiles seemed just a little too knowing, told a different story. What started as a few shared cups of coffee after church services soon turned into long lunches, private messages, and quiet conversations about life, love, and everything in between. Emily had always felt like an outsider in her own life, surrounded by expectations, by the role she had to play. But with Sophia, she felt seen, understood, even cherished. They would meet in secret, finding small windows of time when neither of their husbands would be home. The stakes of their relationship only heightened the thrill, the risk of being discovered added a forbidden intensity to their connection. They had to be careful, always looking over their shoulders, making sure they weren't seen or heard. Every touch, every word they shared, had to be disguised, hidden beneath layers of plausible deniability. But even in the secrecy, Emily could feel the fire between them, burning brighter every time they were together. They started sharing intimate moments, silent touches that spoke louder than any words could, brief but meaningful glances that lingered a little too long. Emily would find herself eagerly awaiting their next meeting, her heart racing with both excitement and dread. She had never allowed herself to feel something like this before, but with Sophia, it felt right. It felt real. And for the first time, Emily felt like she wasn't living a lie, like she was finally embracing the truth of who she was, even though the consequences of doing so could destroy everything. Sophia, for her part, was equally captivated by Emily. She had always been the picture of grace, the wife of the respected pastor, loved and adored by the congregation, but beneath the surface, she too had been hiding parts of herself. Her own marriage to Pastor Daniel was one of duty, not passion, and though she cared deeply for her husband, she knew something was missing. She had always pushed those feelings aside, convinced that her life was meant to be one of service, that she should sacrifice her own desires for the sake of her marriage and the church. But Emily made her feel seen in a way no one else had, and she couldn't help but be drawn to her. Sophia didn't plan for this. She didn't expect to fall in love with another woman, but with Emily, it was impossible to deny the connection that had formed between them. Their relationship progressed in secret, each stolen moment adding weight to the growing feelings between them. They met in hidden corners of the park, in dimly lit cafes, under the guise of friendship, when in reality, their hearts were intertwined in a way neither had anticipated. Emily would find herself thinking of Sophia constantly, when she was with Nate, at work, even in the quietest moments when everything was still. Sophia was always on her mind, a constant presence in her thoughts. But despite the magnetic pull between them, both women knew the stakes of their actions. They lived in worlds where such a love was not only forbidden but could be catastrophic. For Emily, the risk was especially great. She had a husband, a public life, and a carefully constructed image that she couldn't afford to shatter. She had worked too hard for the life she had, and the thought of losing it all terrified her. But with every touch, every word from Sophia, the fear seemed to dissipate. In those moments, Emily felt like she was finally living her truth. Sophia, too, understood the risks. Her relationship with Emily was not only dangerous to her marriage but also to her position in the church. Pastor Daniel trusted her implicitly, and the thought of his world crumbling because of a secret love affair made her heart ache. But the pull to be with Emily was too strong. She had tried to resist it, but every time she saw Emily, every time they exchanged a lingering touch, she found herself unable to stop. The guilt that initially weighed on her began to fade, replaced by a desperate need for Emily's love and companionship. They began to exchange letters, hidden messages, sealed with care, sent through secretive channels. These notes were their lifeline, their escape from the realities they faced. They couldn't let anyone discover what was between them, but in the privacy of their messages, they could confess their deepest feelings. And with each letter, their bond grew stronger. But as their relationship deepened, so did the tension. The guilt gnawed at both of them, and the fear of being discovered never left their minds. They both knew that their love, no matter how real or powerful, was something they could never share openly with the world. And so, they continued to live in the shadows, clinging to each other in secret, each moment together a stolen treasure that could never be fully theirs. The love they shared was both beautiful and tragic, an affair that burned brightly but could only ever exist in the darkness. For months, Pastor Daniel Mitchell had sensed something was off. He couldn't put his finger on it at first, but there were subtle changes in his wife, Sophia Green. Small, almost imperceptible shifts in her behavior, yet they were enough to stir the simmering unease in his gut. As a man of faith and conviction, Daniel trusted his instincts, especially when it came to his wife. Something was amiss, and he couldn't ignore it any longer. At first, the signs were innocuous. Sophia seemed a little more distant, a little less engaged during their quiet dinners at home. She had always been the epitome of grace and poise, the pillar of their community, always there to support him and the church. But now, she seemed distracted, her mind elsewhere. The deep conversations they used to share about their work, their faith, and their shared life seemed to have dwindled to routine exchanges. When they did speak, it was as if her mind were somewhere far away. The most jarring change, however, was her sudden preoccupation with her phone. Sophia, who had always been somewhat reserved when it came to technology, now seemed to be constantly checking her messages, often with a furtive glance, hiding the screen when Daniel entered the room. It wasn't like her to keep secrets, but there was something about her behavior that began to trigger a feeling of discomfort in Daniel, a gnawing suspicion that he couldn't shake. He tried to brush it off at first. Maybe it was just a phase, he told himself. Perhaps she was just busy with her charity work, or maybe the stress of their public lives had started to wear on her. But as the days turned into weeks, the signs grew more blatant. Sophia would disappear into their study for hours, often telling him she was working on church-related matters. But when Daniel checked her calendar or tried to ask her about her work, the answers seemed vague, evasive. She was becoming more guarded, more closed off. One evening, after a particularly quiet dinner, Daniel watched as Sophia slipped away again to check her phone in the other room. His suspicion flared. He had always trusted her implicitly, but this change in her demeanor was undeniable. He decided, almost impulsively, to follow her. As he silently moved through the house, staying just far enough behind to remain undetected, he saw her step into the study, the door clicking shut behind her. Daniel paused. Something felt wrong. He didn't want to do it, but the doubt was consuming him. He needed to know if his fears were unfounded, if he was simply overreacting. But the more he thought about it, the more convinced he became that something was hidden from him. With a quiet, almost guilty breath, he grabbed his phone and decided to check the security footage in their living room. It was a decision that would change everything. As the video played, his pulse quickened. The footage showed Sophia meeting someone in their home, someone he didn't recognize, Emily Johnson, the woman from the church who had always been so involved in their charity events. The two women exchanged smiles and soft laughter as they walked through the front door. The footage continued, and Daniel watched, heart racing, as the two of them sat together in the living room, their conversation quiet but intimate. He couldn't hear their words, but the way Sophia's body language changed as she leaned in, the way they looked at each other, was enough to send a jolt of realization through him. His heart sank. The truth hit him like a wave, and for a moment, Daniel was paralyzed with disbelief. Sophia, his wife, the woman he had trusted above all else, was hiding something from him. And it wasn't just any secret, it was a betrayal of the most profound kind. A love affair, not with another man, but with another woman. Emily Johnson. Daniel couldn't breathe. His hands shook as he paused the footage, replaying the moments over and over in his mind. He tried to justify it, to come up with some explanation, but deep down, he knew there was no excuse for what he had just witnessed. The shock was overwhelming, but as the initial wave of disbelief began to subside, anger began to replace it. For days, Daniel wrestled with his emotions. He wanted to confront Sophia immediately, demand answers, but something inside him told him to wait. He wasn't sure why, maybe it was because he didn't want to believe it, or maybe it was because he needed to find out more. He wasn't ready to face the truth, to confront the reality that his wife had been living a double life, hiding her desires, her secret love affair with Emily. The idea of it sickened him, but the more he thought about it, the more certain he became that he had to confront her. He couldn't let this go on any longer. The following days were torturous. Sophia's behavior remained unchanged on the surface, but Daniel could see through her facade. He watched her, waiting for the right moment to confront her. He was both devastated and furious, devastated by the betrayal, furious with himself for not noticing the signs sooner. But the most unsettling part was the silence. Sophia knew something had changed between them, but neither of them spoke about it. Finally, the tension became too much. One afternoon, when Sophia returned from a charity meeting, Daniel could no longer hold it in. His emotions boiled over, and the facade of calm cracked. Why? His voice was hoarse, betraying the hurt that laced every syllable. Why her, Sophia? Why Emily? Sophia froze, her face paling as the reality of her husband's discovery hit her. Her breath caught, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. Daniel's eyes were locked on her, his anger barely contained, while Sophia stood frozen, the weight of her betrayal hanging between them. She had been caught, and there was no turning back. "I didn't mean for this to happen," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I never wanted to hurt you." But the words felt hollow, meaningless. Daniel's heart shattered as the truth slowly came to light. His world had been turned upside down by a secret he never could have imagined. The woman he loved was not the woman he thought she was, and the reality of it was something Daniel would have to face, no matter how painful it was. The question now was, what would he do with this knowledge? The tension in the Mitchell household had reached a boiling point. Pastor Daniel Mitchell could no longer ignore the gnawing suspicion that had been plaguing him for weeks. The truth was clear now. Sophia Green, his wife, had been hiding a secret relationship with Emily Johnson, a woman from their church who had always seemed so devoted, so involved in their charity work. The realization was crushing, but Daniel knew one thing for certain: he couldn't let this continue. He needed answers, and he needed them now. With his heart heavy with both betrayal and rage, Daniel decided to confront Emily. She had been the catalyst of this entire mess, and he believed that confronting her directly would finally bring clarity to the twisted web of lies. He wasn't sure what he would do once he had the answers, but he was sure of one thing: he had to face Emily and make her understand the consequences of her actions. The stakes were too high, and the pain too deep to ignore. On the afternoon of June 15th, Daniel found himself standing at the front door of Emily's house. His heart pounded in his chest as he rang the doorbell, each chime echoing like a countdown in his mind. The weight of his decision hung over him, and he couldn't escape the dread that gnawed at his insides. He wasn't sure what he expected when Emily opened the door, but it certainly wasn't what he saw. Emily greeted him with her usual calm demeanor, a polite smile on her lips, though her eyes betrayed the nervousness she tried to hide. She hadn't yet realized that Daniel knew everything about the affair, everything about the lies, everything about the life she had been hiding. For a moment, there was an awkward pause as she stepped aside to let him in, her hands nervously adjusting the hem of her blouse. As soon as Daniel crossed the threshold, the air seemed to shift. The house, which had once been a sanctuary of peace, now felt like a battlefield. The tension was palpable, thick with the weight of unspoken words. Emily, still unaware of the storm that was about to break, offered him a seat. Daniel declined, his eyes never leaving her face. "I know about you and Sophia," Daniel said, his voice low and steady, but the anger beneath it was unmistakable. "I know what's been going on between you two. The lies, the secrets, it all ends today." Emily froze. Her face drained of color, her lips parting in a breathless gasp. She had been caught, there was no denying it now. Her mind raced, trying to find an explanation, an excuse, but nothing came. The truth was right there in front of her. "Daniel, I never meant for this to happen," Emily stammered, her voice shaking with fear. "I never wanted to hurt you or Sophia. I never knew how to stop what was happening between us." Daniel's eyes burned with fury. "You never knew how to stop. You never knew how to stop betraying your husband, your marriage, your faith." His voice rose with each word, the frustration and pain breaking through. "Do you have any idea what you've done? You've torn our lives apart." The silence that followed was suffocating. Emily opened her mouth to speak again, but no words came out. Her eyes welled with tears, guilt flooding her heart. She had never imagined it would come to this, never imagined that the love she had found in Sophia, though hidden in shadows, would lead to such devastating consequences. But now, facing Daniel's rage, she realized that everything she had done had led to this moment of reckoning. "I never wanted this to come out like this," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. "But I couldn't stop. It felt real. I loved her. And I know it was wrong." Daniel's fists clenched at his sides. He had heard enough. "You think this is some kind of excuse?" His voice cracked, a mix of disbelief and rage. "You think your love for her justifies the destruction you've caused?" Emily took a step back, her heart pounding in her chest. She had never seen Daniel like this, never felt the full force of his anger until now. The man who had once been so calm, so controlled, now looked like a man on the edge, a man who had been betrayed in the worst possible way. "Please, Daniel," Emily pleaded, her voice breaking. "I'm sorry. I never meant to hurt you." But her words fell on deaf ears. In that moment, all Daniel could feel was a crushing sense of betrayal, and the rage that had been building inside him for months finally erupted. He lunged forward, his hands shaking as he grabbed a nearby fork from a tray of fruit that Emily had offered him earlier. Without thinking, driven by a blind, unrelenting fury, Daniel plunged the fork into Emily's abdomen. She gasped, her eyes wide with shock as the sharp pain seared through her body. Blood began to spill from the wound, soaking through her blouse and staining the floor beneath her. Emily crumpled to the ground in disbelief, the shock and pain rendering her unable to cry out. Her hands tried weakly to staunch the flow of blood, but it was too late. She looked up at Daniel, her face pale and filled with shock and sorrow, but there was no time for words, no time for apologies. In the split second before her vision blurred, she realized that her life, her secret, her affair, had led her to this tragic end. Daniel stood over her, panting, his own heart racing as he stared down at the woman who had once been a part of his life. The reality of what he had done hit him like a wave, but it was too late. Emily's body lay still, blood pooling around her as the life drained from her. The room, once filled with the sound of their confrontation, fell into an eerie silence. Daniel stood frozen, his mind racing, unable to process what he had just done. It wasn't just the physical act of violence that haunted him, it was the realization that his world had been irreparably shattered. He had lost everything, his wife, his faith, and now the very life of the woman who had betrayed him. Panicked and horrified by his own actions, Daniel stepped back, his breath ragged, his mind racing. He had made a terrible mistake, and there was no undoing it. His only thought now was to cover his tracks and escape before anyone discovered what he had done. But as he turned to leave, the weight of his actions pressed down on him, suffocating him in a way that no escape could ever ease. The death of Emily Johnson wasn't just the end of an affair, it was the beginning of a nightmare that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The following hours after Emily Johnson's death were a blur of panic and confusion for Pastor Daniel Mitchell. In the aftermath of his violent confrontation, Daniel knew he had done something that could never be undone. The murder of Emily was not only an act of rage but also one that would change the course of his life, and the lives of those around him, forever. As the adrenaline from the attack began to fade, the gravity of his actions set in. His hands trembled, his mind racing as he stared at Emily's lifeless body lying in a pool of blood. But even in the thick fog of his guilt and disbelief, one thought dominated his mind: he had to cover his tracks. He had to make sure no one would ever find out what had happened. In the moments that followed, Daniel tried to collect himself. He knew he couldn't stay in the house, and yet, the horror of leaving Emily's body behind weighed on him. With frantic urgency, he wiped down any surfaces he had touched and tried to erase any evidence that could link him to the crime. He quickly arranged for Emily's body to be positioned in a way that might suggest a struggle had occurred, hoping to mislead investigators. Then, he left the house, his heart pounding with every step as he made his way into the quiet of the evening, not knowing the storm that was about to descend on his life. Meanwhile, as Daniel attempted to cover his tracks, the police were already beginning to investigate. The 911 call that Nate had made earlier in the evening had set the wheels of justice into motion. The officers arrived at the scene, unsure of what they would find. When they entered the home and saw the bloody body of Emily Johnson lying in the living room, they knew that something brutal had occurred. The scene was chaotic, unsettling, and the officers quickly began to secure the area, calling in forensic teams to process the crime scene. Detective James Bradford, a seasoned investigator with years of experience handling homicide cases, was put in charge of the investigation. He had seen many murder cases, but something about this one felt different. The lack of witnesses, the blood spatter in the living room, and the almost staged appearance of the crime scene set off red flags. The fact that Emily was so well known in the community, a respected member of the church, only heightened the stakes of the investigation. Detective Bradford knew that if the truth was hidden here, it would not stay hidden for long. As the forensics team began their work, collecting evidence, taking photographs, and dusting for fingerprints, Detective Bradford turned his attention to Emily's personal life. She had been involved in several church activities, and from initial witness statements, it seemed as though she had led a quiet, orderly life, until now. The detective knew that in cases like this, the victims' relationships often held the key to unraveling the mystery. The first breakthrough came when they found Emily's phone, discarded on the kitchen counter. It was a crucial piece of evidence, and it would lead the investigation down a path that no one had expected. After analyzing the phone's contents, the police discovered a series of encrypted messages between Emily and Sophia Green, the wife of Pastor Daniel Mitchell. The messages were passionate and intimate, revealing a hidden affair that had been kept secret for months. The discovery of these messages sent shockwaves through the investigation. Detective Bradford's instincts told him that the truth behind Emily's death was more than just a random act of violence, it was connected to something deeper, something personal. He immediately put out an alert to interview Sophia, who had been out of the spotlight up until then. Sophia was stunned when the police arrived at her door. Her heart sank as they presented the evidence, a series of explicit messages from Emily, discussing their secret love affair. The detective's questioning was sharp, and he pushed Sophia to explain her relationship with Emily. Sophia, visibly shaken, tried to maintain her composure, but the truth was undeniable. She had been having an affair with Emily, and though it was hidden from her husband, the detectives now had the proof they needed. As the investigation deepened, more questions began to surface. Detective Bradford expanded the search for evidence, scouring the church and speaking to people who knew Emily and Sophia. Witnesses began to come forward, revealing that the two women had been spending a lot of time together outside of church activities. Some had seen them walking together in the park, others had noticed private conversations that seemed more than just friendly exchanges. The puzzle pieces were slowly falling into place. At this point, the investigation took a dramatic turn when it was revealed that Nate Carter, Emily's husband, had been unaware of his wife's affair. According to him, their marriage had been troubled for a while, but he had never suspected that Emily had been hiding such a deep secret. He was brought in for questioning and seemed genuinely distraught over the loss of his wife. However, the detectives found his alibi for the time of Emily's murder to be airtight. He was not involved, but the emotional toll of the loss left him unable to provide any further helpful information. As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that Pastor Daniel Mitchell, the man at the center of it all, had also been hiding secrets of his own. The detectives began to look closer at his behavior and his connection to the case. When they reviewed security footage from the area around Emily's home, they saw him arriving at the house on the day of the murder. His presence in the neighborhood, and the fact that he had visited Emily's house just hours before her death, raised further suspicions. The moment of truth came when the police tracked down Daniel at his home. When confronted with the evidence, he broke down under the weight of his guilt and admitted to his role in Emily's murder. He confessed that the confrontation between the two had escalated into violence when Emily had refused to stop the affair with Sophia. Overcome with rage and betrayal, he had acted impulsively, ending Emily's life in a moment of blind fury. The confession was a devastating blow to everyone involved. The secrets, the lies, and the betrayals had all been exposed, leaving behind a trail of destruction. The community was shaken to its core, and the investigation revealed just how far-reaching the consequences of one affair could be. For Detective Bradford, the case was closed, but it left him with a bitter taste. The truth was now known, but it was a truth that no one had wanted to face. As Daniel Mitchell was taken into custody, the echoes of the tragedy that had unfolded in that quiet suburban home would haunt everyone who had been touched by it for years to come. The days following Pastor Daniel Mitchell's confession were a whirlwind of media coverage, shock, and disbelief. The news of the brutal murder of Emily Johnson, a well-respected member of the community, and the secret affair between Emily and Sophia Green, the wife of the town's beloved pastor, sent ripples of scandal through the entire town. People who had known the Mitchells for years, even decades, struggled to comprehend how such a horrific crime could unfold within their midst. The tragedy revealed the dark undercurrents that had been festering beneath the surface of seemingly perfect lives. For Daniel, the weight of his confession was a crushing reality. The act of finally admitting to the murder had been the culmination of days of unbearable guilt, internal conflict, and deep shame. As the police led him away in handcuffs, his mind raced, but he had no illusions left. The man who had once been a trusted pastor, a leader within his church, had now become a murderer. The community he had served for years, the congregation who had looked up to him as a beacon of faith, would never forgive him. And, in truth, Daniel wasn't sure he could forgive himself. Sitting alone in the interrogation room, Daniel was faced with the consequences of his actions. Detective James Bradford sat across from him, watching the man who had once been a figure of power now reduced to a broken, defeated soul. After hours of questioning, Daniel had finally broken down, admitting that it had been the discovery of his wife's affair that had pushed him to the edge. In a blind fit of rage, he had murdered Emily, plunging a fork into her abdomen in a moment of uncontrollable fury. "I never meant for it to happen," Daniel murmured, his voice barely audible, as if he were trying to convince himself of that same lie. "I loved her. I loved Sophia. But the betrayal, the lies. I just couldn't take it." Detective Bradford, though sympathetic to the anguish that Daniel had clearly been suffering, knew that his feelings of regret could never undo the damage he had done. Emily Johnson was dead, her family shattered, and the repercussions of his violent outburst would extend far beyond the tragic loss of a life. The case, now solved, had uncovered a far deeper tragedy, one that exposed the lies, deceit, and broken trust at the heart of the Mitchells' marriage. The confession was swift, and Daniel was charged with second-degree murder. The community watched in disbelief as the news of his arrest spread. How could someone so seemingly righteous, a man of God, commit such an atrocious act? The local church, which had once been a sanctuary of peace, became a place of scandal and shame. Daniel's once loyal congregation was divided. Some mourned the loss of the man they had thought they knew, while others felt betrayed and deeply hurt. The congregation, who had trusted him to guide them through their spiritual lives, now faced the reality of his crime. For Sophia Green, the fallout was no less devastating. Her world had already been shattered by the public revelation of her affair with Emily. She had tried to keep her secret hidden, trying to maintain the facade of the perfect pastor's wife, but it had all unraveled in a matter of days. The guilt that had been gnawing at her for months had finally come to light, and the aftermath of her actions was impossible to ignore. Sophia was devastated by Emily's death. She hadn't anticipated that their affair would spiral so far out of control. When she had first met Emily, she had been drawn to her, attracted to the warmth and kindness that Emily exuded. What had started as a secret, innocent friendship had quickly turned into something far more dangerous and complicated. And now, with Emily dead and her husband behind bars, Sophia was left to pick up the pieces of her broken life. The truth of the affair was out, and she could no longer hide behind the lies she had told herself. The consequences of the affair stretched beyond the personal betrayal. It had destroyed Sophia's marriage and fractured the trust she once shared with Daniel. In the wake of the murder, Sophia was left to face her own guilt and shame. The community had lost faith in her, and her place in the church seemed untenable. The grief over Emily's death and the fractured relationships that followed left Sophia feeling lost and alone, questioning her actions and the choices she had made that had led her here. For Nate Carter, Emily's husband, the consequences were no less devastating. He had been blindsided by the revelation of his wife's affair and her tragic death. He had always believed that his marriage was solid, that the bond between him and Emily was unbreakable. But the truth shattered him. He had no idea that Emily was living a double life, carrying on a secret affair while he was away serving his country. The betrayal cut him to the core, and the grief of losing her in such a brutal, violent way was a pain he struggled to comprehend. The emotional toll on Nate was immense. He felt both heartbroken and deeply betrayed, unsure of how to cope with the pain of losing his wife in such a horrific way. He wrestled with the idea of how Emily's affair had gone unnoticed for so long, and the guilt of not having been more aware of the cracks in their relationship gnawed at him. But as the investigation unfolded and Daniel's confession came to light, Nate realized that, in many ways, the truth was even worse than he had imagined. Emily's life had been a lie, and her death was a direct consequence of the secrets she had kept hidden. The murder trial would follow, and the courtroom became another stage for the emotional fallout of the events that had transpired. As the trial unfolded, Pastor Daniel Mitchell faced the harsh reality of his actions. He pled guilty to second-degree murder, acknowledging that he had killed Emily in a blind fit of rage after discovering the affair between her and Sophia. The courtroom was filled with sorrow and grief, and the truth was impossible to escape. Daniel's sentencing was swift, but the pain left behind would haunt everyone involved for years to come. As the community tried to heal, the memory of Emily's tragic death lingered, casting a long shadow over the town. The relationships torn apart, the lies exposed, and the lives forever changed were the true consequences of the events that unfolded. The grief of loss, the weight of guilt, and the struggle for redemption would continue to echo in the hearts of those left behind, long after the trial had ended and the pages of the story had been turned. The trial was over. The sentences had been handed down, and the legal system had done its part. But for Pastor Daniel Mitchell, Sophia Green, Nate Carter, and even the community that had once embraced them all, the consequences of their actions would linger long after the courtroom doors had closed. Daniel Mitchell was sentenced to life in prison for the second-degree murder of Emily Johnson. The once respected pastor, a man who had stood at the pulpit and delivered sermons on love, forgiveness, and faith, now faced the harsh reality of a life behind bars. His name was no longer synonymous with grace, it was a name forever tied to violence, betrayal, and the destruction of everything he had once stood for. Daniel's world had crumbled, and he had no one to blame but himself. His own confession had sealed his fate, and though he was remorseful, the damage was irreversible. But the pain of his actions didn't just affect him. The repercussions rippled through the lives of those closest to him, none more so than Sophia Green, his wife, whose life was left in shambles. The public revelation of her affair with Emily, and the subsequent murder, left her ostracized from both the church and the community. Sophia had always been the perfect pastor's wife, the one people turned to for counsel, for kindness, for spiritual guidance. But now, she was nothing more than a scandal in the eyes of many. The guilt she had carried for so long, the secret she had kept from her husband and everyone else, had torn apart her marriage and her reputation. Sophia tried to make amends in the weeks that followed, but the damage was too great. The community had lost trust in her, and her standing in the church, once solid and unwavering, was now beyond repair. She spent months in isolation, attempting to find a way to atone for her mistakes, but the weight of the betrayal hung over her. Emily's death, tragic and senseless, had been the result of her own choices. Sophia had allowed the affair to continue, knowing the risks, knowing how it could destroy her marriage and her life. She had never imagined it would come to murder, but it did. As for Nate Carter, the death of his wife had torn apart the very foundation of his life. He had returned from military service, expecting to find comfort in his wife's embrace, only to discover the horrific truth. His marriage had been a lie, and the woman he loved had been living a double life. The revelation that Emily had been having an affair, and that her lover's husband had killed her, was too much for Nate to bear. In the days after her death, Nate struggled to reconcile the woman he had known with the one that had been hiding so many secrets. The grief of losing Emily, compounded by the betrayal, was a burden he carried heavily. He found it difficult to return to his work and his community life. The world he had known before felt like a distant memory, a place where everything had been simple and clear-cut. But the loss of Emily and the trauma of discovering her affair changed him forever. He became a man in mourning, both for his wife and for the trust that had been shattered between them. Nate found solace in quiet moments, alone with his thoughts, but the pain of his loss never fully subsided. He could not easily forgive Emily for her betrayal, but at the same time, he couldn't bring himself to hate her. The tragedy had left him with more questions than answers. In the aftermath of the murder, the small town that had once been a place of peace and tranquility was forever changed. The community struggled to heal, the wounds left behind by the scandal too deep to ignore. Families who had known each other for generations found themselves divided. The church, once a place of sanctuary, became a battleground where opinions clashed over the actions of their pastor and his wife. Some rallied behind Sophia, expressing sympathy for her, while others turned their backs on her, unable to forgive the betrayal. Trust, once freely given, was now something that had to be earned, and it would take years, if ever, for the community to rebuild what had been broken. The story of Emily's death, the affair, and the eventual murder, became the subject of whispered conversations in every corner of the town. It was a story that no one could forget, a tale of love, deception, and tragedy that would echo through the halls of the church, the homes of the town's residents, and the lives of those directly involved for the rest of their days. As time passed, life slowly began to move forward for the people affected by these events, but the shadows of the past were never far behind. Daniel Mitchell would serve his time in prison, a man forever defined by his crime. Sophia Green would spend the rest of her life seeking redemption, though she knew that some things, some relationships, could never be repaired. Nate Carter would eventually find peace, but the scars of betrayal would always remain with him. The death of Emily Johnson was a catalyst, one that changed the lives of everyone it touched. And while the legal system had exacted its toll, it was the emotional and psychological costs of the crime that would haunt those left behind. In the end, the people of the town were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives and try to find a way to move on, knowing that some wounds are too deep to ever fully heal. The legacy of Emily's tragic death would be a painful reminder of how easily lives can be torn apart by betrayal, how secrets can destroy everything, and how the consequences of our actions are far-reaching, affecting not just ourselves, but the lives of everyone around us. The scars of this tragedy would remain, not just in the minds of the people who had known Emily and the Mitchells, but in the very fabric of the community itself.